Terraria 2 isn't a new idea. In fact, it's something that's been on the mind of Terraria's original creator, Red, as far back as 2013, according to an interview he did with Rock Paper Shotgun. And when a sequel to Terraria is mentioned, I'm sure the first thing your mind goes to is Terraria Otherworld, which is fair enough considering it is the closest thing we ever got to one, but even when that was being developed all those years ago, it was never meant to be a sequel. The actual Terraria sequel, however, was planned to begin development once Otherworld was finished and released, which never happened. And if you want to know all about that, you should watch this video from this pretty cool guy. Lynx, I think his name was. Great video. 10 out of 10. Might as well subscribe while you're there too. But anyway, the release of Otherworld was meant to coincide with the release of 1.3, giving Terraria a final boss and a proper ending. And around this time, it really did seem like everything was gearing up for Terraria's development to slow down, and for the Relogic team's main focus to switch over to developing its sequel. But that never ended up happening. Terraria 2's current state is unknown, and the idea is pretty much in limbo. But that doesn't mean we can't speculate and try to piece together an idea of what Terraria 2, if it was released, would actually end up looking like. I want to go over 3 main points: why I believe developing Terraria 2 is a necessary next step and a great idea all around, what the game might end up looking like if we ever got it, and how it would affect Terraria as a whole. But before we begin, I just want to mention again that until we hear anything official from Relogic, everything in this video is purely speculation, but will be based on small pieces of information and comments the developers have given us over the years. So this is my best guess as to what Terraria 2 might look like. Now I want to first start off by answering a pretty common question. Is Terraria 2 even necessary? I see this argument brought up a lot when discussing the prospect of Terraria 2, where it's compared to making a sequel to Minecraft. It just doesn't make sense, and people don't really see the point. There's also the argument where people say they'd rather more content updates for the original game, rather than have the developers shift focus onto a sequel. Now the arguments against Terraria 2 are fair, I see where they come from, but ultimately they're pretty weak. In reality, there's a lot more to be argued about why Terraria 2 is not only a great idea, but actually a pretty necessary one when you really look at it. Terraria is an old game. Well, old when you look at it through the software it's coded with. It was developed using the .NET framework in Microsoft XNA, which hasn't been officially supported since 2014. It's deprecated, and sure, it worked fine at the time, but now, over a decade later, it's actively holding the developers back from implementing bigger and better ideas into the game. A lot has changed since 2014. And the fact that Terraria is still being actively developed in this framework is crazy. Now the developers have done a great job finding workarounds and ways to push the limits of the framework, but it's definitely a huge hurdle to development. And while it doesn't make sense to completely recode Terraria from the ground up just to get around these limitations, it does make sense to build a sequel to Terraria in a completely new engine where these limitations no longer apply. Terraria in a newer and modern game engine would be a huge deal. Enough of a reason on its own to warrant a full-fledged sequel game. Things that just aren't possible to add into current Terraria because of what it's coded in suddenly become feasible. We could see infinite worlds being added to the game, something both the players and developers have wanted for a long time, but just something that isn't possible in the current engine. On top of that, the modding scene would be completely revolutionized. Mods are one of the big reasons Terraria has managed to stay so relevant over the course of its lifespan, with some mods like Calamity and Thorium being large enough that they could almost be considered DLC content or a separate Terraria game entirely. Imagine if the developers behind all of these mods, who were already working to push the limits of what Terraria is capable of, suddenly had access to a modern and significantly more powerful engine. We could see mods that no one would have ever thought possible in Terraria. Another strong reason to work on a sequel is the worry of adding too much content to Terraria's base game, which on the surface sounds like it couldn't possibly be a bad thing, but there is definitely a line. Terraria already has a staggering amount of content. Enough content to warrant hundreds, even thousands of hours of replayability. And it is starting to feel like we're getting into the territory of what else is there to even add. I don't mean to say there's not an endless amount of ideas of content, but what can you really add to Terraria at this point? Because you can't really introduce huge changes and massive new content updates without beginning to clutter and even take away from the game and its core progression. I do love that Terraria is still getting updates after all these years, and I love the updates we have gotten, minus the NPC portraits, but I do think we're quickly approaching that line where there's just not enough room to fit in more content without things feeling cluttered or Terraria's main progression being changed. But a Terraria 2 would fix that. Suddenly there's a new canvas ready to receive another decade's worth of content updates. More wiggle room to experiment and try out new things while not taking away from the original experience of Terraria. So yeah, I believe Terraria 2 makes sense. I think there's too many reasons in favor of it that completely outweigh any doubt or argument against it. So, if Relogic did end up developing Terraria 2, What would it actually look like? At this point we're mainly speculating, but throughout the years Red and Senex have given us a few hints and details about what their vision for Terraria 2 might look like, and it does let us paint a bit of a picture. Speaking of painting pictures, check out this concept art for Terraria 2 drawn by none other than Red himself, and wow! Picasso couldn't hold a pencil to this guy, I mean come on! Look at those smooth, crisp brushstrokes drawn in none other than MS Paint itself. Beautiful. Yeah, so this is a rough SketchUp of what Red posted to Twitter showing his idea of what the Terraria 2 map might look like. Now it is very rough and very not final, but you can kinda see where Red's mind is at. There's a lot of biome diversity, a huge jungle tree with a sprawling branch system, and a cool new dungeon structure in some kind of acid biome. There's a space and volcano biome, an underworld biome with this guy, and a giant Meowmere stuck in a cloud. I really don't know what's going on here. But I think the main thing we're meant to take away from this is that Terraria 2 will have a much bigger world and much greater biome diversity, which is something Red himself mentioned wanting in a future Terraria game, alongside having infinite worlds and a more cohesive lore that ties the entire world together. And honestly, a proper story to follow in Terraria is something I'd be really interested in, seeing as the original Terraria very clearly has lore to it, but there was just never a full story planned around it, aside from what we got for one of Terraria's anniversaries, which was just written as an afterthought. When it comes to features we might end up seeing in the game, it'd be pretty hard not to bring up Otherworld, at least a little bit. Well yeah, this wasn't the sequel and therefore shouldn't be the expectation of what Terraria would be, there were a lot of features showcased in this game that I think could definitely be salvaged and worked into Terraria 2. For example, underwater biomes and swimming. The oceans in Terraria are probably one of its biggest areas of critique because there's just nothing interesting going on over there. But Terraria 2 could change that. We could see a proper swimming mechanic, deep sea biomes that make exploring the ocean's depths worthwhile, and new creatures and plants that give the underwater landscape new life. We could also potentially see the introduction of a weapon mastery system. This is something we saw brief screenshots of in Terraria Otherworld, and I honestly think it'd be a great addition to Terraria 2. A system where the more you use a certain weapon, the more its stats are leveled up and the stronger it becomes. This would also make reforging completely obsolete. Gone would be the days of forking over your entire life savings to the Goblin Tinkerer just to end up with shoddy on your weapons. No one likes that kind of RNG. We could also see the reworked hooks make an appearance in Terraria 2. Actually, this is something I almost guarantee we will see because Senex has already shown a lot of interest in adding it to a sequel game. And this also seemed to be a rework that everyone at Relogic really loved, considering there's an entire teaser video for Otherworld that just features swing grappling. Otherworld also had a bit of a quest system. It's hard to tell how central to the game the mechanic was going to be from the screenshots we saw, but I think something like this might have a bit of a place in Terraria 2. I don't mean full on everything is structured and you have to follow a linear path, because I think that kind of takes away from the point of Terraria. I mean quests that just nudge the player in the right direction. Terraria doesn't really have a great way of teaching new players where to go. Sure, the guide exists, but we both know he's useless. So imagine a quest system that can act as a way to guide the player in progression while not being very intrusive, just so there's something in the game that avoids having to look up a wiki page to figure out what to do next. Beyond these features, a while ago Red posted to Twitter looking for community suggestions for new updates, and a lot of the suggestions given were met with the response Terraria 2 idea. These were things that were either too big and technically complex to introduce into Terraria, or something that would have just changed the base game too much. So we might see some of these suggestions being implemented into Terraria 2 if it were to ever release. And now finally, how would Terraria 2 affect the original Terraria? Well, I don't think Terraria 2 will ever be as popular as the original, considering it's the 7th best-selling game of all time. It's just an unrealistic expectation, and I don't see it happening personally. But that's hardly any reason not to develop a sequel. Relogic really only have one game under their name, well, unless you count Pixel Privateers, which they were the publishers of, but I don't really. Expanding out into new games would be incredibly good for the longevity of Relogic as a company, even if Terraria is still selling millions of copies every year. I also don't believe that by developing Terraria 2, Terraria would just be completely abandoned. In fact, this is something the devs have explicitly stated would not be the case. What we would likely end up seeing is a small team focused on developing small reworks and content updates for Terraria, while the majority of the Relogic team switched focus over to developing the sequel game. And I think this is actually the better outcome for Terraria. Small content updates and tiny reworks that don't really intrude on core progression, while Terraria 2 receives the big sweeping content updates and changes. It's also very unlikely that the entire community just switches from Terraria over to Terraria 2, especially not in the beginning. Terraria took years to reach the level of content it's at now, and Terraria 2 would probably need a similar amount of time to reach that level as well. I could see people going back and forth between the two games. That's how I would play. And when it comes to modding, I would wager a guess that the modding scene might move entirely to the new game. The limitations that come with Terraria's current framework not only apply to Relogic, the team actually developing the game, but also to modders creating new content content for the game. I think modders would immediately jump ship to develop mods for Terraria in a modern engine, and I think we'd see some truly incredible stuff being made. All in all, I think Terraria 2 is a great idea. I think it makes sense, and I think there's too many reasons in favor of making the sequel to let the idea fizzle out. And personally, I honestly do think one day we will see Terraria 2. The devs clearly want to work on it. It's been an idea in Red's mind since 2013, and it seemingly hasn't gone anywhere. And, well, since 2022, ReLogic have been working on something, whether it's Terraria 2, an entirely new original game, or something that'll just never see the light of day. We don't know yet. But what we do know for sure, from Red himself, is that in a reply to someone asking what the point of a sequel or remaster to Terraria would even be, he just says, "You ain't seen nothing yet."